March 14, 1953. Two Soviet MiG pilots scramble to intercept an unidentified object over restricted airspace. Within minutes, they're closing in at maximum speed. Ground control tracks them. The pilots report visual contact, their voices tight with confusion. It's impossible. Nothing flies like that, then silence. The radar signatures vanish. Radio goes dead. Two state-of-the-art fighters and their pilots simply cease to exist. No wreckage, no bodies. Just empty sky and a secret buried for 40 years. The declassified documents tell a story that defies explanation. What happened in those final moments is more disturbing than you can imagine. March 14, 1953, 2:47 a.m., Bykovo Air Base, 35 kilometers southeast of Moscow. The night shift radar operator, Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov, stared at his scope with growing unease. Something was wrong. Very wrong. A contact had appeared at the edge of his screen, altitude approximately 10,000 meters, moving at a speed that made no sense, too fast for a bomber, too high for most aircraft of the era, and it was heading directly toward Moscow's restricted airspace. Volkov's hand moved to the scramble alarm before his mind had fully processed what he was seeing. In 1953, with Stalin dead barely 2 weeks and the Soviet Union in a state of paranoid transition, any unidentified aircraft was treated as a potential American attack. The Cold War wasn't just cold. It was frozen solid with mutual terror. The alarm shattered the pre-dawn silence. Across the base, pilots jolted awake in their quarters, already moving before consciousness fully returned. This was what they trained for, what they feared, what some secretly hoped for, a chance to prove themselves against the American threat they'd been told, was coming since childhood. Two pilots reached the alert fighters first. Captain Yuri Bajenov, 34, a decorated veteran of the Great Patriotic War with over 2,000 flight hours. His wingman, Lieutenant Alexei Mironov, 26, younger but sharp, a rising star in the Soviet Air Defense Forces, with reflexes that had earned him top marks in every combat simulation. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that they were about to face something that no amount of training could prepare them for. Something that would make their combat experience against German Messerschmitts seem like child's play. The ground crew had the MiG-15 Biz fighters ready. These weren't the laughable machines the Americans had mocked earlier in Korea. These were the improved variants, powered by Klimov VK-1 engines producing 5,900 pounds of thrust, capable of reaching 175 kilometers per hour at altitude. Armed with one 37mm cannon and two 23mm cannons, these fighters represented the cutting edge of Soviet aerospace engineering. Bayanov's hands moved through the pre-flight checks with practiced efficiency. Battery on, fuel pressure confirmed, hydraulics green. Oxygen flow verified. The cockpit of a MiG-15 was cramped utilitarian, purely functional. No comfort, no excess. Just the minimum required to kill the enemy and return home. Ground control's voice crackled through his headset, clipped and urgent. Viper lead, you are cleared for immediate takeoff. Vector 090, climb to Angels 35. Unknown contact, high speed approaching restricted zone. Weapons are cleared hot. Repeat, weapons hot. This is not a drill. Weapons hot. Those two words meant everything. They weren't going up to identify. They were going up to destroy. Bajenov's engine roared to life, the distinctive whine of the Soviet turbojet cutting through the darkness. Beside him, Mironov's aircraft spooled up in perfect synchronization. They'd flown together for 8 months. They trusted each other absolutely. In aerial combat, that trust meant the difference between life and death. The tower cleared them. Bajenov released the brakes and felt the MiG surge forward, acceleration pressing him back into his seat. The runway lights blurred into streaks. At 260 kilometers per hour, he pulled back on the stick and felt the aircraft leap into the black sky. Mironov stayed glued to his wing, exactly where he should be. They were airborne at 2:51 a.m. 4 minutes from alarm to wheels up. Textbook response. Everything was going exactly according to procedure. The Soviet Air Defense Forces were the best in the world, they'd been told. American bombers wouldn't stand a chance, but they weren't chasing an American bomber. As Bajenov banked toward the intercept vector and pushed his throttle to maximum military power, ground control began feeding him updates. The target was accelerating, already passing 200 kilometers per hour. Altitude increasing to 12,000 meters, then 13,000. These numbers made no sense. No known aircraft could perform like this. Bajenov's years of combat experience triggered a response he'd learned over German skies. When something doesn't make sense, assume the worst. His thumb moved to the cannon arming switch. The weapons panel glowed red. Ready to kill. At 2:54 a.m., ground control reported radar contact between the fighters and the unknown object. Distance 45 kilometers and closing. Bajenov scanned the darkness ahead, searching for navigation lights, engine glow, anything that would tell him what he was facing. 2:57 a.m., altitude 11,000 meters. The black Soviet sky stretched endlessly in every direction, stars brilliant in the thin atmosphere above the cloud layer. Bajenov's eyes swept the darkness systematically, using the technique he'd perfected, hunting German night fighters. Look slightly off-center. Let your peripheral vision catch movement. Don't stare directly at anything. Then he saw it. His breath caught. The training, the discipline, the years of combat experience, all of it vanished in an instant of pure primal confusion. Ground control, Viper lead, I have visual contact. His voice was steady, professional. Years of Soviet military conditioning held firm. But his hands were shaking. Viper lead, describe the target. The ground controller's voice carried an edge of urgency. They needed to know what was violating their airspace. American bomber? Reconnaissance aircraft. British Canberra. Bajenov struggled to find words for what he was seeing. Target is... It's circular, metallic, no visible wings, no tail assembly, no engine nacelles. It's reflecting moonlight. Estimate diameter at 15 to 20 meters. Silence from ground control. They were processing what couldn't be processed. Circular? No wings? This violated every principle of aerodynamics the Soviets understood. The object hung in the sky ahead of him, perhaps 8 kilometers distant, at roughly the same altitude. It wasn't moving like an aircraft. It wasn't falling. It wasn't climbing. It was simply there, motionless, as if gravity had forgotten it existed. Viper 2 confirm visual. Bajenov needed his wingman to see this. Needed confirmation that his oxygen system wasn't malfunctioning, that he wasn't experiencing hypoxia-induced hallucinations. Viper 2 confirms visual contact. Ground control, this is not an aircraft. Repeat, this is not an aircraft of any known type. Miranov's voice cracked slightly. The young pilot's confidence was fracturing against impossible reality. Ground control responded, but there was hesitation now, uncertainty. Viper lead, close to identification range. Maintain weapons ready status. Attempt radio contact on international emergency frequency. Bajenov switched frequencies and transmitted in Russian, then English. Unknown aircraft, you are violating Soviet airspace. Identify yourself immediately, or you will be fired upon. The words felt absurd even as he spoke them. You don't radio contact something that shouldn't be able to fly. No response. The object remained motionless, silent. A metallic disc, hanging impossibly in the stratosphere. Bajenov began his approach, reducing throttle, extending his intercept pattern to come alongside rather than directly astern. Standard procedure for visual identification. Get close. See markings. Report back. But his training hadn't prepared him for approaching something that defied physics. At 5 kilometers distance, the object moved, not like an aircraft accelerating. Not like anything Bajenov had seen in thousands of hours of flight time. It simply relocated. One moment it was ahead, the next it was 2 kilometers to his right at the same altitude. Instantaneous, no acceleration curve, no turn radius. Just impossible repositioning. Did you see that? Miranov's voice was rising toward panic. Ground control. Target just moved 3 kilometers in less than 1 second. No visible means of propulsion. No heat signature. This is not possible. The radar operator at Bikovo was seeing the same thing on his scope. The contact had jumped, not moved across his screen like a normal aircraft. It had disappeared from one position and reappeared in another. The recorded radar tapes, later classified and locked away for 40 years, would show this clearly. A discontinuity in reality itself. Viper lead, ground control. Approach and maintain visual contact. Central Command is being notified. Translation: we don't know what to do. Keep watching it while people above our rank make decisions. Bayanov adjusted his heading, bringing his MiG around toward the object's new position. His fuel gauge showed he had maybe 20 minutes before he'd need to return to base. 20 minutes to make sense of the senseless. As he closed to 3 kilometers, the object moved again. This time it ascended, climbing from 11,000 meters to 15,000 meters in approximately 2 seconds. Vyachenov's instruments showed his own aircraft's maximum climb rate was 50 meters per second. This thing had just climbed at 2,000 meters per second. Ground control, Viper lead. Target is ascending at impossible rate. Ham pursuing. Bajanov pulled his stick back and pushed throttle to maximum. The Klimov engine screamed. G-forces pressed him into his seat. The altimeter spun upward. 12,000 meters, 13,000, 14,000. The object waited for him. That's what disturbed Bajanov most. It wasn't fleeing. It was waiting. Like it was studying them, playing with them, demonstrating capabilities that shouldn't exist. At 15,000 meters, Bajanov leveled off, his MiG shuddering slightly in the thin air. The object hung there 2 kilometers ahead, perfectly stationary. Miranov pulled alongside, his wingman discipline overriding his fear. Viper lead, I have tone. Miranov had activated his gun sight. He was preparing to fire. Negative, Viper 2, hold fire. Bajanov didn't know why he gave that order. Maybe instinct. Maybe the recognition that their 37mm cannons might be completely irrelevant against whatever this was. The object began to glow. Soft at first, a pale blue luminescence emanating from its surface. Then brighter, brighter, until it hurt to look at directly. The cockpit of Bajanov's MiG was flooded with cold blue light that cast sharp shadows and made his instruments difficult to read. Ground control. Target is emitting intense light. Unknown spectrum. I'm experiencing instrument interference. Radio static increasing. My compass is spinning. Then the object moved toward them fast, impossibly fast, closing 2 kilometers in less than 2 seconds. Bajanov's combat instincts took over. He broke hard right, pulling maximum G-force, his vision tunneling toward blackout. Miranov broke left, the 2 MiGs separating in practiced defensive maneuver. The object stopped between them. It hung there, equidistant from both Soviet fighters, rotating slowly. The blue glow intensified, and then something happened that ground control heard clearly on the recorded tapes, something that made the incident impossible to dismiss, impossible to explain away. Both pilots began screaming. The screaming lasted exactly 7 seconds. Then it stopped, not gradually, not with the trailing off of voices losing consciousness. It stopped like someone had flipped a switch. Complete silence on the radio frequency. At Bykovo Air Base, Senior Lieutenant Volkov stared at his radar scope in disbelief. 3 contacts had been visible seconds ago. 2 MiG-15s and the unknown object, all at 15,000 meters, all distinct and clear. Now there were only 2 contacts. The MiGs remained on his screen, but something was wrong. Their flight paths had changed. They were no longer flying standard intercept patterns. They were pursuing the object, diving, climbing, banking in tight turns that should have torn the wings off their aircraft. The radar return showed velocities and G-forces that exceeded every safety parameter in the Soviet manual. Viper lead. Bykovo control. Respond immediately. Captain Bajanov acknowledge. Nothing, dead air. The radio frequency was open. The carrier wave visible on the communications panel, but no voice came through. Viper 2 acknowledge. Still nothing. Volkov's hand moved to the emergency alert button. This was beyond his authority now. This required immediate attention from the highest levels. What Volkov couldn't see, what the radar couldn't tell him, was what was happening in those cockpits, 15,000 meters above the frozen Russian landscape. The declassified documents, released partially in 1991 and more completely in 2003, contained testimony from other pilots who had been scrambled as backup. What they witnessed would become one of the most disturbing accounts in Soviet military history. Captain Igor Kurnitsov, flying a MiG-15 from Kubinka Air Base 60 kilometers west, had been ordered into the air 3 minutes after the initial scramble. He was climbing through 12,000 meters when he saw them. 2 Soviet fighters, clearly identifiable by their silhouettes, flying in pursuit of something that reflected moonlight, like polished chrome. Kurnitsov's testimony, recorded in 1991, was clinical but couldn't hide his underlying horror. The two lead aircraft were flying beyond their performance envelope. I watched them execute a vertical climb that should have stalled their engines. They reached at least 18,000 meters, altitude where MiG-15s barely have control authority. They were following the object, chasing it, but their movements weren't normal. The turns were too tight, too precise. Like they weren't being flown by humans anymore. The object was leading them. That became clear to everyone watching from the ground and from other aircraft converging on the scene. It would accelerate, the two MiGs would follow. It would climb, they would climb with it, pushing their aircraft beyond designed limits. It would dive and they would dive, reaching speeds that approached the sound barrier. This continued for approximately 4 minutes. 4 minutes of aerial pursuit that defied every principle of physics and piloting. Ground control continued broadcasting, ordering the aircraft to respond, to break off, to return to base. The radio remained silent except for one brief moment. At 3:04 a.m., the radio crackled to life. A voice came through, broken, distorted, barely recognizable as human speech. The official transcript, locked away until 1991, recorded these words: "Can't control, not flying. Something in my head following. Have to follow. Can't stop." The voice could have been Bajenov, could have been Miranov. The audio quality was too degraded, too overlaid with static and interference. But the words were clear enough. The pilots weren't in control of their aircraft. Something else was. Major Pyotr Dolgov, commanding the air defense sector, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. At 3:05 a.m., he ordered 2 additional MiG-15s to arm missiles and prepare to shoot down the Soviet aircraft if they approached Moscow's restricted zone. Better to lose 2 pilots than risk whatever this was reaching the capital. But the order became irrelevant seconds later. The object, which had been leading the 2 MiGs in an increasingly erratic pattern, suddenly accelerated vertically. The radar return showed it climbing from 15,000 meters to 25,000 meters in less than 3 seconds, an acceleration of over 300 G-forces. Anything inside would have been crushed to paste. The 2 MiGs followed. Captain Kurnitsov, still climbing to intercept, watched in horror as the 2 Soviet fighters pulled into vertical climbs that should have been impossible. Their engines were at maximum power. I could see the afterburner glow even at that distance. They were climbing at rates that exceeded even rocket-assisted takeoff performance. The structural stress should have torn them apart. But they stayed intact, following that thing into the stratosphere. At 25,000 meters, the object leveled off. The 2 MiGs leveled off beside it. For a moment, perhaps 5 seconds, all 3 contacts remained stationary on radar. Kurnitsov, now at 16,000 meters and struggling to climb higher, could still see them. 3 objects in formation, 2 Soviet fighters flanking an unknown craft, almost like an honor guard. Then the object moved again, not vertically this time, horizontally, but at a speed that made the radar operators think their equipment had malfunctioned. The contact accelerated from stationary to over 3,000 kilometers per hour in less than 2 seconds. An acceleration that would have liquefied any human pilot. The 2 MiGs accelerated with it. I watched them go, Kurnitsov's testimony stated. All 3 objects moving together, accelerating beyond anything I'd ever seen. They crossed the horizon in seconds. Just gone. The speed was incomprehensible. And our fighters stayed with it the entire time, like they were connected. Like they were part of it. The radar at Bykovo tracked them for another 30 seconds. The 3 contacts moved east, accelerating continuously, climbing to 30,000 meters, then 35,000. The speed exceeded 4,000 kilometers per hour, then 5,000. Numbers that shouldn't have been possible for any aircraft in 1953 at 3:07 a.m. at an altitude of approximately 40,000 meters and a speed estimated at 6,000 kilometers per hour. All 3 radar contacts vanished simultaneously. Not gradually, not one by one. All 3 disappeared from every radar screen tracking them in the same instant. Senior Lieutenant Volkov stared at his empty scope. He checked every setting, verified every system. The radar was functioning perfectly. The contacts were simply gone, vanished, as if they had never existed. In the command center, Major Dolgov picked up the red telephone that connected directly to Moscow. The conversation that followed would trigger one of the largest cover-up operations in Soviet history. Because at 3:07 a.m. on March 14, 1953, the Soviet Union had lost 2 fighters and 2 pilots to something that officially couldn't exist. And somewhere in the vast darkness above the Soviet Union, Captain Yuri Bajenov and Lieutenant Alexei Mironov were gone. Simply gone. Taken by something that could fly at impossible speeds, withstand impossible forces, and somehow make Soviet fighters and their pilots do the same. Both pilots began screaming. 3:09 a.m. Bykovo airbase fell into controlled chaos. The radar screens remained empty. Radio frequencies crackled with static but carried no voices. 2 of the Soviet Union's most advanced fighters had vanished without a trace, taking their pilots into the black void of the stratosphere. Major Dolgov stood in the command center, his hand still gripping the red telephone, connecting him to Moscow Central Air Defense Command. The voice on the other end was cold, clipped, demanding immediate answers. "Repeat your last transmission, Major. You're telling me 2 MiG-15s have disappeared from radar." "Confirmed, Comrade Colonel." Both aircraft vanished simultaneously at 3:07 a.m. Last known position approximately 400 kilometers east of Moscow, altitude 40,000 meters, speed in excess of 6,000 kilometers per hour. They were pursuing an unidentified object when all 3 contacts disappeared from scope. Silence on the line. "Then, what do you mean, unidentified object?" Dolgov hesitated. In the Soviet Union of 1953, admitting you'd lost aircraft chasing something you couldn't identify was career-ending at best, fatal at worst. Stalin's paranoia had permeated every level of military command. Failure meant suspicion. Suspicion meant interrogation. But there was no way to hide this. Too many people had seen. Too many radar operators had tracked it. Too many radio intercepts had been recorded. "Sir, an object entered our airspace at 2:47 a.m., circular metallic, approximately 15 to 20 meters in diameter. No wings, no visible propulsion. Capable of speeds and maneuvers beyond any known aircraft. The interceptors pursued it for 20 minutes before all contacts disappeared." Another silence. Longer this time. When the voice returned, it was different, quieter, more dangerous. "Major, you will secure all radar tapes, all radio recordings, all flight logs immediately. No one discusses this incident. No one files reports through normal channels. A team from Moscow will arrive within 2 hours. You will cooperate fully." This conversation did not happen. "Do you understand?" "Understood, Comrade Colonel." The line went dead. Dolgov stared at the phone for a moment, then turned to his operations officer. "Lock down the base. No one leaves. No phone calls, no radio transmissions, except on secure military frequencies. Confiscate all personal logs. The radar tapes go into the vault now." Within minutes, armed guards were stationed at every exit. The radar room was sealed. Every operator who had witnessed the incident was isolated in separate rooms. This wasn't standard procedure. This was something else entirely. This was how the Soviet Union made inconvenient truths disappear. But sealing the base couldn't stop what was already happening 400 kilometers away. As dawn broke over the Russian wilderness, the search had begun. Not officially, not with paperwork and authorization, but the moment those aircraft vanished, every military installation within 500 kilometers had been alerted to watch for crashes, parachutes, emergency beacons. Nothing. The sky remained silent. No distress signals, no wreckage spotted by the dozens of aircraft now crisscrossing the projected flight path. It was as if the 2 MiG-15s had simply ceased to exist, erased from reality along with their pilots. Captain Kurnetsov, who had witnessed the final moments, landed at Kubinka at 3:45 a.m. He was immediately surrounded by armed guards and escorted to a sealed room. No debriefing, no chance to speak with his squadron mates, just isolation and the sound of boots echoing down concrete corridors. He would remain in that room for 18 hours before the men from Moscow arrived. At Bykovo, the families were being notified. Not truthfully. Never truthfully. The base commander, following orders that had come from Moscow within minutes of the incident, sent junior officers to the homes of Captain Bajenov and Lieutenant Mironov, with carefully scripted messages. Training accident. Aircraft lost. Search ongoing. Further information will be provided as it becomes available. The words were chosen precisely. Training accident suggested pilot error. Mechanical failure, something explainable and mundane. Not the truth. Never the truth. That two experienced combat pilots had been taken by something that defied every principle of physics and aerodynamics. Bajanov's wife, Katerina, knew immediately that something was wrong. Her husband had over 2,000 flight hours. He'd survived the crucible of combat against the Luftwaffe. Training accidents didn't happen to pilots like him. She demanded details. The junior officer, barely out of academy, could only repeat his script. Further information will be provided as it becomes available. It never would be. Not to her. Not to Miranov's parents, elderly and devastated in their Moscow apartment. Not to the squadron mates who had flown with these men for years. The truth would be buried under layers of classification so deep that even most military commanders would never see it. By 5:30 a.m., the first of the special investigators had arrived at Bikovo. They weren't regular military. They wore civilian clothes, carried credentials that made colonels snap to attention, and spoke with authority that suggested connections to the very highest levels of Soviet power. The KGB had arrived. Major Dolgov was the first to be interrogated, not debriefed, interrogated. The distinction was clear in the tone, the questions, the underlying threat that permeated every word. Tell us exactly what appeared on radar. Every detail, every anomaly. And Major, understand that we will know if you're embellishing, if you're creating stories to cover incompetence. Dolgov told them everything. The impossible speeds, the instantaneous position changes, the way the MiGs had followed as if controlled. The final acceleration and simultaneous disappearance. He expected disbelief, dismissal, perhaps accusation of being drunk on duty. Instead, the investigators took notes in silence, asked specific technical questions, requested precise measurements and timings. Their reactions suggested something disturbing. They weren't surprised. This wasn't the first time they'd heard a story like this. One investigator, a man who introduced himself only as Comrade Petrov, asked the critical question. Major, in your professional opinion as an air defense commander with 15 years of service, was this an American aircraft? Some new reconnaissance platform or experimental bomber? Dolgov considered lying, considered saying yes, give them something they could work with, something that fit within acceptable reality. But he'd seen the radar returns. He'd heard the witness testimony. He'd watched 3 contacts vanish simultaneously at impossible altitude and speed. No, Comrade Petrov, this was not American. This was not aircraft of any nation on Earth. Petrov nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he already knew. That assessment will not appear in any official report, Major. Officially, your pilots encountered equipment malfunction during a training exercise and crashed in remote terrain. The wreckage has not yet been recovered due to difficult conditions. Search operations continue. That is the only story. Do you understand? I understand. Good. Because alternative interpretations would suggest either American technology we cannot comprehend, which makes us look weak, or phenomena that cannot exist according to Soviet scientific principles, which makes us look foolish. Neither option is acceptable. Your pilots encountered mechanical failure. That is what happened. Repeat it. My pilots encountered mechanical failure. Again. My pilots encountered mechanical failure. Until you believe it, Major, until everyone believes it. The same process was repeated with every witness. Every radar operator, every radio technician, every pilot who had seen anything. One by one they were isolated, interrogated and told the official story. Mechanical failure, training accident, tragic but explainable. Nothing extraordinary, nothing impossible, nothing that would make the Soviet Union appear ignorant of phenomena occurring in its own airspace. By noon on March 14th, the official story was set. 2 MiG-15s had crashed during a routine training exercise in remote terrain east of Moscow. Captain Yuri Bajanov and Lieutenant Alexei Miranov were missing, presumed dead. Search operations were ongoing, but hampered by difficult conditions. The families would receive full military honors and pensions. The radar tapes were confiscated. locked in vaults in Moscow, where they would remain for 38 years. The radio recordings were seized. The personal logs of every witness were destroyed. Even the wreckage of the incident, the physical absence of debris, became part of the cover-up. Search ongoing, the report said. Month after month, year after year. Always searching, never finding, because there was nothing to find. The families held funerals with empty caskets. Military honors were rendered to men who had simply vanished. Medals were awarded posthumously. And the truth, the impossible truth that 2 pilots and their aircraft had been taken by something that defied explanation, was buried so deep that even speaking of it became dangerous. Captain Kurnetsov, the witness pilot, was transferred to a remote base in Kazakhstan 3 weeks later. No explanation given, no discussion allowed. He would spend the next 10 years flying patrol missions over empty desert. His testimony locked away in files marked State Secret Special Importance. Senior Lieutenant Volkov, the radar operator who had first detected the object, was reassigned to a ground radar station monitoring the Arctic approaches. Isolation duty. His security clearance was revoked for any sensitive installations. The message was clear: see too much and your career ends. Major Dolgov received a promotion, transferred to Moscow, given a comfortable desk job with good pay and no operational responsibility. The reward for silence, for cooperation, for helping make the impossible become officially explainable. But late at night, in private moments, these men would remember, would see those radar returns showing impossible speeds, would hear that broken radio transmission, something in my head, can't stop, would wonder what had happened to Bazhenov and Miranov. In those final moments, as they followed something beyond human comprehension into the darkness above Soviet skies. The Soviet Union had lost aircraft before, to weather, to mechanical failure, to pilot error, even to American fighters during the Korean War. But those losses came with explanations, with wreckage, with bodies to bury. This was different. This was 2 men and 2 machines simply ceasing to exist, erased from reality by something that officially couldn't exist. And the silence that followed, enforced by armed guards and career-ending threats, was more terrifying than the incident itself. Because if the Soviet government was willing to bury this so completely, it meant one of 2 things. Either they knew what had taken those pilots and were hiding it, or they had no idea, and that ignorance terrified them more than any enemy they'd ever faced. March 14, 1953, ended with empty radar screens, sealed files, and 2 families mourning men who had vanished without trace. The official story was set. The witnesses were silenced. The evidence was locked away. But the truth, the impossible truth, remained. Somewhere in the darkness above Soviet airspace, something had taken 2 fighters and their pilots, and it had done so with ease that suggested this wasn't the first time, and wouldn't be the last. March 15, 1953. Dawn broke cold and grey over the Nizhny Novgorod region, 400 kilometers east of Moscow. Snow covered the endless forest in a white blanket that stretched to every horizon. This was the projected crash zone, calculated from the last known radar positions before the aircraft vanished. If the MiGs had fallen, they would be somewhere in these vast empty woodlands. The search operation began officially at 6 a.m. On paper, it was standard protocol for missing aircraft. 3 Mi-4 helicopters, 6 search teams on the ground, air patrols flying grid patterns over 10,000 square kilometers of terrain. By Soviet military standards, this was a significant commitment of resources. But everyone involved knew this wasn't a normal search. Major Konstantin Borisov commanded the ground search teams. A veteran of partisan operations during the Great Patriotic War, he'd searched for downed aircraft before. He knew what to look for: impact craters, debris fields, the distinctive smell of aviation fuel, scorched trees from post-crash fires. In his 15 years of recovery operations, he'd never failed to find wreckage. Aircraft don't simply disappear. They leave evidence always. This time would be different. The search teams moved through the forest in careful lines, spacing themselves 20 meters apart, eyes scanning snow and trees for any sign of impact. The helicopters flew low overhead. Observers pressed against windows looking for broken tree canopy, disturbed snow. Anything that would indicate a 3-ton aircraft had fallen from the sky. Nothing. By noon, They'd covered 400 square kilometers. Not a single piece of debris, not a scrap of metal, not a burned tree. The snow was pristine, undisturbed except by animal tracks and the boot prints of the searchers themselves. Borisov radioed his findings to command. The response was immediate and expected. Expand the search area. What Borisov didn't know was that he was looking in the wrong place entirely. The calculated crash zone assumed normal aircraft behavior, normal physics, normal trajectories. But the radar data, locked away in Moscow vaults, showed the MiGs had accelerated to over 6,000 kilometers per hour before vanishing. At that speed, even if they'd crashed, the wreckage could be 1,000 kilometers away or more. The search area should have been the size of Western Europe, but admitting that would mean admitting the radar data was accurate. And the radar data couldn't be accurate because it showed impossible things. So the search continued in the designated zone, a bureaucratic exercise performed for the files, for the families, for the appearance of competent military response. By March 17th, 72 hours after the incident, the search had expanded to 15,000 square kilometers. Hundreds of soldiers combed through frozen forest. Aircraft flew thousands of hours of search patterns. Local populations were questioned. Had anyone seen aircraft? Heard explosions? Seen parachutes? Fire in the sky? The answers were universally negative. But hidden in the official reports, buried in footnotes that would be classified for decades, were other testimonies. Strange testimonies. Testimonies that didn't fit the official narrative of a training accident. A farmer near the village of Pavlovo, 380 kilometers east of Moscow, reported seeing lights in the sky around 3 a.m. on March 14th. Not aircraft lights, something else. 3 objects moving together at incredible speed. 2 smaller, following a larger one. They glowed blue, bright enough to cast shadows on the snow. They crossed the entire sky in seconds, moving east. Then they rose straight up and disappeared. No sound, no engine noise. Just gone. His testimony was recorded by a junior officer and filed in the daily report. It was marked irrelevant by the reviewing commander and buried in archives. A farmer's confused observations had no place in a serious military investigation. A meteorologist at an observation station near Kazan, 500 kilometers east of the search zone, recorded unusual radar interference around 3:05 a.m. Strong electromagnetic disturbance, origin unknown. Affected all equipment for approximately 3 minutes. Compass needles spinning. Radio communications disrupted. Then everything returned to normal. His report was filed and forgotten. Soviet Air Force colonel flying a transport aircraft over the Ural Mountains at 3:10 a.m. reported seeing an unusual glow in the western sky, very high altitude, lasting approximately 10 seconds before fading. His report was noted and dismissed. High-altitude atmospheric phenomenon, nothing relevant to the missing fighters. But if someone had compiled these reports, plotted them on a map, tracked the times and locations, a pattern would have emerged. A pattern showing 3 objects moving east at extraordinary speed, climbing to extreme altitude, disappearing over the Urals. A pattern that matched perfectly with the last known trajectory of the missing MiG-15s and the object they were pursuing. No one compiled these reports. Officially, there was no reason to. The missing aircraft had crashed somewhere near Moscow. The search continued in the designated zone. Everything else was coincidence, misidentification, irrelevant observation. By March 20th, 1 week after the incident, the search began to wind down. The official explanation evolved. The aircraft had likely crashed in one of the region's many deep lakes, now frozen over. Recovery would be impossible until spring thaw. The search would be suspended and resumed in May, when ice conditions permitted diving operations. It was a perfect bureaucratic solution. Explained the lack of wreckage, provided justification for ending the expensive search operation, gave the families a plausible reason for why their loved ones' bodies couldn't be recovered. And most importantly, it closed the file without requiring anyone to acknowledge impossible speeds, mysterious objects, or radar data that showed physics-defying performance. The families were informed. Captain Bajenov and Lieutenant Miranov were declared dead in service to the motherland. Their names would be added to memorial walls. Their widows and children would receive pensions. Funeral services with empty caskets would be held with full military honors. The machinery of state mourning processed their disappearance into officially acceptable grief. But Katerina Bajanova didn't believe it. Her husband had survived being shot down twice over Germany. He ditched in the Baltic Sea and swum 2 kilometers to shore in freezing water. He was the most careful, skilled pilot she'd ever known. Training accidents didn't happen to men like him, and crashes into frozen lakes left debris, oil slicks, something. She began asking questions, quietly at first. Who had been flying with him? What was the nature of the training exercise? Could she see the flight logs? The accident investigation report? Each question was met with polite deflection. Military security. Operational secrecy. The investigation is ongoing. Doors closed. Phone calls went unreturned. Friends in the military stopped visiting. Then, in early April, she received a visit from 2 men in civilian clothes. They were polite, almost friendly. They explained that her husband's death was a great loss, that the state appreciated his service, that his family would be well cared for. But they also explained that continuing to ask questions would be interpreted as doubting the official findings. And doubting official findings could suggest political unreliability, could affect her children's future opportunities, educational placement, career prospects, party membership. The message was clear. Accept the official story or face consequences. Not immediate arrest, not in 1953 with Stalin barely cold, but the slow destruction of opportunity, the gradual isolation that made life in the Soviet Union unbearable. The velvet glove hiding the iron fist. Katerina stopped asking questions, but she never stopped knowing that something was wrong. That the official story was a lie. That somewhere, somehow, her husband had encountered something the Soviet state couldn't acknowledge and wouldn't explain. Meanwhile, in Moscow, in offices that didn't officially exist, a different kind of search was underway. The KGB's investigation wasn't looking for wreckage. They were looking for patterns, precedents, other incidents that might match what had happened on March 14th. What they found was disturbing. The files went back years, decades even. Reports from pilots, radar operators, ground observers. Most had been dismissed as equipment malfunction, pilot error, weather phenomena. But when viewed together, with the knowledge of what had happened to Bayanov and Mironov, they formed a pattern. August 1948, a MiG-15 over the Black Sea pursued an unidentified object at high altitude. The pilot reported losing control. The aircraft was recovered, crashed into the sea 200 kilometers from its last known position. The pilot's body was never found. Official cause: spatial disorientation, November 1950. 2 fighters scrambled from Murmansk to intercept unknown contact. Both aircraft lost radio communication simultaneously. Both reappeared on radar 30 minutes later, flying in formation at extreme altitude. When they landed, both pilots claimed no memory of the 30-minute gap. They were diagnosed with carbon monoxide, poisoning, and quietly discharged from service. February 1952. A radar station in Kazakhstan tracked 3 objects moving at speeds exceeding 3,000 kilometers per hour. When fighters were scrambled to intercept, the objects climbed vertically and disappeared from scope. The radar operators were reassigned. The tapes were classified. Official explanation: equipment malfunction. March 1953. 2 MiG-15s pursued an unidentified object and vanished completely. No wreckage, no bodies, no explanation. The pattern was undeniable. The Soviet Union was experiencing regular incursions by something that could outperform their best aircraft, evade their radar, and occasionally make pilots and planes disappear. The incidents were increasing in frequency, and the government had no explanation and no defense. In a secret meeting in late March 1953, senior KGB officials and military commanders reviewed the compiled evidence. The discussion that followed was recorded and classified at the highest level. It wouldn't be partially declassified until 1993, and even then, significant portions were redacted. One exchange, however, survived intact. A KGB colonel asked the essential question: if these are American aircraft, why can't we identify them? Why can't our best fighters match their performance? Why do they abduct our pilots? The military commander's response was chilling. If these are American, then the technology gap is so vast that we've already lost any potential conflict. We're defending against an enemy we cannot match, cannot counter, cannot even comprehend. But if these are not American, he paused. If these are not American, then we have an even more serious problem, because then we're dealing with something for which we have no reference, no doctrine, no response capability whatsoever. The decision made in that meeting would shape Soviet policy for the next 4 decades. Incidents would be documented, witnesses would be recorded, evidence would be preserved. But publicly, officially, none of it existed. The Soviet Union would not admit to being helpless against unknown incursions, would not acknowledge phenomena it couldn't explain or control. The search for Bajanov and Miranov officially ended on April 15, 1953. The final report concluded that both aircraft had crashed into frozen Lake Nizhny, 320 kilometers east of Moscow. Their bodies were unrecoverable. The case was closed. The files were sealed. The families received their pensions and their medals and their empty caskets. But in the forests, in the villages, in the scattered observation posts across the Soviet Union, people who had seen things continued to watch the skies. The farmer near Pavlovo still talked about the 3 glowing objects, though he learned to keep his voice down. The meteorologist at Kazan still checked his equipment every night, wondering if the electromagnetic disturbance would return. The colonel who'd seen the glow over the Urals still looked up during night flights, searching for something he couldn't name, and in Moscow, in vaults protected by armed guards and classification stamps marked permanent, the evidence accumulated. Radar tapes showing impossible speeds, radio recordings of pilots losing control, testimony from witnesses who'd seen things that shouldn't exist. All of it preserved. All of it hidden. All of it waiting for the day when the truth could finally be told. That day would come. But not for another 38 years. Not until the Soviet Union itself collapsed and the secret archives began to open. Not until old men could finally speak about what they'd witnessed without fear of punishment. Not until the impossible could be acknowledged, even if it still couldn't be explained. That day would come. But not for another 38 years. Not until the Soviet Union itself collapsed and the secret archives began to open. Not until old men could finally speak about what they'd witnessed without fear of punishment. Not until the impossible could be acknowledged, even if it still couldn't be explained. The search for wreckage had failed. But the search for truth had only just begun. April 1953. Deep within the Lubyanka building in Moscow, headquarters of the KGB, a new department came into existence. It had no official name, no public budget, no organizational chart that appeared in any government directory. In internal documents, it was referred to only as Department 13, Special Phenomena Division. Its mission was simple and impossible: investigate incidents involving unidentified aerial phenomena, document evidence, develop response protocols, and above all, ensure that no information reached the public or foreign intelligence services. The Soviet Union would not admit to being helpless against unknown intruders, would not acknowledge that its airspace was being violated by something it couldn't identify, couldn't intercept, and couldn't understand. Colonel Grigory Petrov, the same man who had interrogated Major Dolgov at Bykovo, was appointed director. His selection wasn't random. Petrov had been investigating similar incidents since 1947. He'd interrogated dozens of pilots, reviewed hundreds of reports, and personally witnessed one encounter in 1951 that had convinced him this was real, not mass hallucination or equipment failure. Petrov's first action was to compile everything. Every report, every witness statement, every radar tape, every photograph that showed anything unexplainable in Soviet skies. The files arrived in crates, pulled from archives across the Soviet Union, military installations, research facilities, weather stations, even civilian aviation authorities. Anything marked unusually unexplained or pending. Investigation was requisitioned. What emerged was staggering. The Soviet Union had been experiencing these incidents at a rate of approximately 15 to 20 per year since 1946. Most were brief radar contacts that defied normal flight characteristics. Some were visual sightings by pilots. A few, like the Bajanov-Miranov incident, involved direct pursuit and catastrophic outcomes. Petrov organized the data chronologically and geographically. Patterns emerged immediately. The incidents clustered around certain locations, military installations, particularly those involved in nuclear research, radar facilities, strategic bomber bases, aircraft manufacturing plants, almost as if whatever was responsible was conducting systematic reconnaissance of Soviet military capabilities. More disturbing were the performance characteristics. Every documented encounter showed the same impossible capabilities: speeds exceeding 3,000 kilometers per hour, instant acceleration with no visible propulsion, right-angled turns at high velocity, vertical climbs that would generate hundreds of G-forces, and the ability to hover motionless in defiance of aerodynamics. The Americans had jet aircraft. The British had advanced radar, but nothing in Western technology approached these capabilities. Either the Americans had achieved a breakthrough so revolutionary it made Soviet military technology obsolete, or something else was operating in their airspace. Petrov suspected the latter, and that suspicion terrified him more than any Cold War scenario. In May 1953, Department 13 established protocols for future incidents. When unidentified objects were detected, fighters would still scramble. But pilots received new instructions, classified as Special Response Protocol Alpha. They were not to pursue aggressively, not to open fire without explicit authorization, not to follow objects beyond Soviet borders or above 30,000 meters altitude. The unspoken message: we're outmatched. Don't provoke what we can't defeat. Simultaneously, the cover-up apparatus was refined into a precise machine. Any incident would be immediately classified. Witnesses would be isolated and debriefed by Department 13 personnel. Families of lost pilots would receive standard accident notifications. Media would be fed mundane explanations: weather balloons, atmospheric phenomena, equipment malfunctions, training accidents. The system worked perfectly for suppressing information internally, but it couldn't control what foreign intelligence was observing. In June 1953, a CIA memo crossed President Eisenhower's desk. The subject line read, "Unusual Soviet fighter activity, possible advanced aircraft testing." The memo detailed Western intelligence observations of Soviet fighters scrambling against unidentified targets, flying erratic pursuit patterns, and occasionally disappearing from radar. The CIA assessment concluded that the Soviets were testing revolutionary aircraft designs, possibly incorporating German wartime research into anti-gravity propulsion or exotic jet engines. The analysis was completely wrong, but it served both sides' purposes. The Americans believed the Soviets had advanced technology. The Soviets wanted the Americans to believe that. As long as the West thought these incidents represented Soviet capabilities, they wouldn't discover the truth, that the Soviet Union was as baffled and helpless as anyone. But the cover-up created its own problems. By suppressing all information, the Soviets prevented their own scientists and engineers from analyzing the phenomena properly. Evidence was locked in vaults, not examined in laboratories. Witnesses were silenced, not interviewed by researchers. The very secrecy designed to protect Soviet prestige prevented them from understanding what they were facing. In August 1953, Department 13 received a report that forced them to confront this contradiction. A MiG-17 had encountered an unidentified object over the Caspian Sea. The pilot, Captain Mikhail Volkov, had maintained visual contact for 12 minutes while following new protocols. He didn't pursue aggressively, didn't open fire, just observed and reported. His description was extraordinarily detailed: a metallic disc, approximately 25 meters in diameter, with a distinct domed structure on top. No visible seams, rivets, or access panels. The surface appeared seamless, almost liquid in its smoothness. It glowed with a faint blue-green luminescence. When it moved, there was no visible exhaust, no jet wash, no propeller effect. It simply translated position, sometimes instantly, sometimes in smooth acceleration that defied inertia. Volkov had gun camera footage, 30 seconds of clear, undeniable film, showing an object that shouldn't exist. The footage was immediately classified and locked away. But before it disappeared into the vaults, several scientists attached to Department 13 reviewed it. Their conclusions were unanimous and disturbing. The object showed no visible means of propulsion. Its movements violated Newton's laws of motion. The material appeared to be metallic, but reflected light in ways inconsistent with any known alloy. And most significantly, when enhanced frame-by-frame analysis was performed, the object appeared to have no internal structure. It was solid, seamless, as if manufactured in a single piece without assembly. One physicist, Dr. Anatoly Kurchatov, wrote in his classified assessment, "This technology is not American. It is not Soviet. It is not within the realm of current human capability. We must face the possibility that we are observing something of non-terrestrial origin." His report was filed, and then buried, because acknowledging non-terrestrial origin meant acknowledging that Earth was being visited by something from elsewhere, and the ideological implications of that admission were incompatible with Soviet materialism, with dialectical materialism, with the entire philosophical foundation of communist thought. Better to classify it as unknown origin and continue collecting evidence while maintaining public denial. The families, meanwhile, continued to suffer. Katerina Bayanova received her pension, raised her children alone, attended annual memorial ceremonies where her husband's name was read alongside other pilots who had died in service. But she never received answers, never learned what really happened on March 14, 1953. The official story never changed. Training accident, crashed in frozen lake, body unrecoverable. Lieutenant Miranov's parents aged rapidly, consumed by grief and unanswered questions. His father, a factory worker in Moscow, became obsessed with finding the truth. He wrote letters to military commanders, to government officials, even to Nikita Khrushchev after Stalin's death. The letters went unanswered, until one day in 1955, when two men visited him at his apartment. They didn't threaten, didn't need to. They simply explained that his son had died serving the motherland, that the circumstances were classified for national security, that continued inquiries would be interpreted as anti-Soviet agitation, that such agitation could have consequences for his entire family. Miranov's father stopped writing letters, but in the privacy of his home he kept a journal, recorded every inconsistency in the official story, every question that went unanswered, every suspicion that something larger was being hidden. The journal survived his death in 1967, passed to his grandson, locked away with family documents. It would eventually become crucial evidence when researchers began investigating the incident decades later. The cover-up extended beyond individual cases. Department 13 established a network of informants within Soviet scientific and aviation communities. Anyone showing unusual interest in aerial phenomena, anyone asking too many questions about unexplained incidents, anyone theorizing about non-conventional propulsion systems, would be quietly identified and monitored. In 1956, a professor at Moscow State University proposed a research project studying anomalous radar returns. His funding application was denied. His security clearance was revoked. He was reassigned to teaching elementary mathematics at a provincial university. The message was clear. Some areas of research were forbidden, even without explicit prohibition. The system was thorough, efficient, and ultimately counterproductive. By preventing open investigation, the Soviet Union ensured it would never understand what was happening in its skies. By silencing witnesses, they prevented correlation of sightings that might have revealed patterns. By hiding evidence, they stopped themselves from developing any effective response to continued incursions. But the incidents continued. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Department 13 files grew thicker. More pilots encountered objects. More radar operators tracked impossible contacts. More witnesses were silenced. More families mourned loved ones who had vanished under circumstances that could never be explained. In 1964, another incident occurred eerily similar to Bayanov and Miranov's disappearance. Two MiG-21s pursued an unidentified object over Siberia. Radio contact was lost. The fighters vanished from radar. No wreckage was ever found. The official story: navigational error, crashed in remote terrain, bodies unrecoverable. The families received the same pensions, the same medals, the same empty promises. By 1970, Colonel Petrov had spent 17 years running Department 13. He documented hundreds of incidents, interviewed thousands of witnesses, compiled thousands of hours of radar data and gun camera footage. He'd built the most comprehensive archive of unexplained aerial phenomena anywhere in the world. And he'd come to a conclusion that he could never officially state: the Soviet Union, despite its military power, despite its nuclear weapons, despite its space program, was completely powerless against whatever was operating in its airspace. These objects came and went at will, demonstrated capabilities that rendered Soviet technology obsolete, and occasionally took aircraft and pilots for reasons that remained utterly mysterious. In a private memo written in 1971, never intended for official files, but preserved in his personal papers, Petrov wrote, "We have built a vast apparatus of denial. We hide evidence from our own people, from our allies, from our enemies, from ourselves. But denial is not defense. We are no closer to understanding these phenomena than we were in 1953, perhaps further, because we have forbidden ourselves from truly investigating. We have chosen institutional ignorance over uncomfortable truth. History will judge whether this was wisdom or cowardice." The memo was found after his death in 1989. 2 years later, the Soviet Union would collapse. The archives would begin to open, and the truth that had been buried for nearly 40 years would finally, partially begin to emerge. But in 1971, the cover-up was at its height. The machinery of denial operated smoothly. Witnesses were silenced. Evidence was hidden. Official explanations were maintained. And in the vaults beneath Lubyanka, in files marked with classifications that ensured they would never be seen, the truth waited. Thousands of pages of testimony, hundreds of hours of recorded transmissions, dozens of photographs and films showing objects that shouldn't exist, all of it proving that on March 14, 1953, and on many days before and after, the Soviet Union had encountered something beyond its comprehension, something that could take aircraft and pilots at will, something that operated with impunity in supposedly controlled airspace, something that, despite 40 years of documentation and investigation, remained as mysterious as the moment Captain Bayanov first saw that metallic disc hanging impossibly in the Soviet sky. The cover-up had succeeded in hiding the truth from the world, but it had failed to hide it from the phenomena itself. Whatever was responsible for these incidents showed no sign of stopping, no indication of being deterred by Soviet denial. It continued its systematic reconnaissance of Soviet territory, its occasional abductions of aircraft and pilots, its demonstrations of technological superiority. And somewhere in the darkness above Earth, perhaps Bayanov and Mironov knew the truth that their government had spent decades hiding, the truth that would eventually emerge, incomplete and fragmentary, when the Soviet state could no longer maintain its elaborate edifice of denial. And somewhere in the darkness above Earth, perhaps Bayanov and Mironov knew the truth that their government had spent decades hiding, the truth that would eventually emerge, incomplete and fragmentary, when the Soviet state could no longer maintain its elaborate edifice of denial. The cover-up was comprehensive, but truth has a way of surviving even the most determined attempts at burial. December 25, 1991. The Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. The Soviet Union, superpower and empire, ceased to exist. In its place emerged 15 independent republics, economic chaos, political uncertainty, and something unexpected: freedom of information. The vaults began to open, not immediately, not completely. The process was chaotic, inconsistent, driven more by bureaucratic confusion than policy decision. Archives that had been sealed for decades suddenly became accessible to researchers, journalists and families who had spent lifetimes seeking answers. Files marked permanent classification were declassified by administrators who no longer feared the consequences of revelation. Among the millions of documents released in the early 1990s were the files of Department 3 Dr. Pavel Strogov, the Russian aerospace historian, was among the first to access them. In 1992, working in a cold basement archive in Moscow, he opened a file marked March 1953 Incident 341B, Bykovo Air Defense Sector. What he found inside would consume the next 5 years of his life. The file contained everything: radar tapes, radio transcripts, witness statements, photographs, technical analyses, gun camera footage. All of it preserved meticulously, hidden for 39 years, now available to anyone with archive access and the patience to work through mountains of bureaucratic documentation. Strogov's hands shook as he read the first page. Captain Yuri Bajenov, Lieutenant Alexei Miranov, 2 MiG-15s, March 14, 1953. Vanished while pursuing unidentified object. No wreckage recovered. No bodies found. Official cause, training accident. But the file told a completely different story. He spent days reading through testimony. Major Dolgov describing impossible speeds. Captain Kurnitsov witnessing aircraft flying beyond their performance envelope. Radar operators tracking objects that shouldn't exist. And most chilling, the partial radio transmission. Can't control. Something in my head. Have to follow. The radar data was included. Charts showing 3 contacts accelerating to over 6,000 kilometers per hour, climbing to 40,000 meters, then vanishing simultaneously. Technical analysis confirmed the data was accurate. The equipment had been functioning perfectly. The impossible readings were real. Strogov published his findings in 1993 in a Russian aerospace journal. The article, titled "The Disappearance of Flight Viper, a 1953 Incident Reconsidered," caused immediate controversy. Mainstream historians dismissed it as sensationalism. Military officials, many of whom had worked in the Soviet system, refused to comment. But the families who had waited 4 decades for answers, seized on it. Katerina Bahinova was 67 years old when she read Strogov's article. Her husband had been gone for 40 years. She'd remarried, raised her children, lived a full life. But the questions had never left her. Now finally she had something resembling answers. Not complete, not satisfying, but better than the lies she'd been told in 1953. She contacted Strogov, met him in Moscow in December 1993, brought with her the letters she'd received from the military, the pension documents, the medals awarded posthumously. And she told him something she'd never told anyone outside her family. 2 weeks after her husband's disappearance, she dreamed of him. A vivid, intense dream unlike anything she'd experienced before or since. In it, Yuri was alive but trapped somewhere, not dead. Not in heaven or any afterlife, trapped, conscious, unable to return. Trying to communicate but unable to reach her. The dream had repeated 3 times over the following weeks, then stopped. She'd dismissed it as grief, as her mind processing loss. But reading the file, learning that the radio transmission suggested the pilots weren't in control, that something had taken them, the dream took on new significance. What if he was trying to tell me something? What if some part of him knew what was happening and tried to reach me? Strogov had no answer, but he included her testimony in his expanded research. Published as a book in 1995, Taken, The Vanished Pilots of the Soviet Air Force. The book compiled dozens of cases similar to Bajenov and Miranov. Fighters disappearing while pursuing unidentified objects. Pilots losing control. Aircraft vanishing without trace. A pattern spanning 4 decades of Soviet military history. The book sold poorly in Russia, where people were focused on surviving economic collapse, not rehashing Soviet mysteries. But it attracted attention internationally. Western researchers, particularly those investigating UFO phenomena, seized on it as validation. Here was documentary evidence from Soviet military files, proving that unidentified objects had been regularly encountered, that they demonstrated capabilities beyond human technology, and that they had occasionally taken aircraft and pilots. In 1996, Russian television produced a documentary about the Bajenov-Miranov incident. They interviewed Strogov, showed declassified radar footage, played portions of the radio transmissions. For the first time, the Soviet public heard about incidents their government had hidden for decades. The response was mixed. Some viewers were fascinated. Others dismissed it as post-Soviet desperation for sensational stories. Many simply didn't care, preoccupied with unemployment, inflation, and the chaos of transition. But among military veterans, particularly pilots and radar operators who had served during the Soviet era, the documentary triggered a flood of private confessions. Former pilots contacted Strogov with their own stories, encounters they'd been forbidden from discussing, objects they'd seen but never reported, orders they'd received to engage unidentified targets. Several described the same phenomenon: losing control of their aircraft, feeling compelled to follow objects, experiencing gaps in memory or time. One retired colonel, speaking anonymously in 1997, described an incident from 1967. "I pursued an object over Kazakhstan. Circular, metallic, impossibly fast. I was ordered to fire. I armed my weapons, but before I could shoot, my hands wouldn't respond. I tried to squeeze the trigger, but my fingers refused to move. The object accelerated and disappeared. When I landed, I couldn't remember the previous 15 minutes. My watch had stopped. Ground control confirmed I'd been off radio for that entire time, but I have no memory of it." In 1998, a former Department 13 analyst came forward. Viktor Chernov had worked in the archives from 1975 to 1985, cataloging reports and maintaining files. He'd read thousands of witness statements, reviewed hundreds of hours of footage, studied decades of accumulated evidence. His testimony, recorded in multiple interviews, provided the most comprehensive insider perspective on the Soviet Union's secret investigation of unexplained aerial phenomena. Department 13 had three primary conclusions by the 1980s, Chernov stated. First, these objects were real, not hallucination or equipment malfunction. Second, they demonstrated technology far beyond Soviet or American capabilities. Third, they appeared to be conducting systematic reconnaissance of our military installations, particularly those involved in nuclear weapons development. But we could never determine origin, intent, or ultimate purpose. The Bajenov-Miranov case haunted the department, he continued. It was our clearest example of direct abduction. We had radar data showing the moment they were taken, radio transmissions suggesting loss of autonomy, witness testimony confirming the aircraft followed the object beyond their performance limits. And then nothing. Complete disappearance. We investigated similar cases in 1964, 1971, and 1982. Different locations, different aircraft, but the same pattern. Pilots pursuing objects, losing control, vanishing. Chernov revealed something else. In 1985, Department 13 had conducted analysis comparing the disappeared pilots, looking for patterns in their backgrounds, training, psychological profiles. We found nothing that explained why these specific individuals were taken, but we did find something else. In several cases, family members reported dreams or sensations of ongoing contact. Spouses feeling their partner was still alive. Children experiencing vivid dreams of their fathers trying to communicate. We documented it but couldn't explain it. Some analysts theorized the pilots might still be alive somewhere, somehow attempting to reach their families. But that theory was classified as speculation without evidence. The revelations continued through the late 1990s and early 2000s. More files were declassified. More witnesses came forward. More documentation emerged. But the Russian government, successor to the Soviet state, maintained official silence. No investigations were opened. No explanations were offered. The incidents were acknowledged as unexplained phenomena, but not studied, not analyzed, not officially examined. In 2003, a significant breakthrough occurred. A former KGB colonel, dying of cancer and with nothing to lose, released his personal archive to researchers. Among the documents were classified assessments from the 1960s and 1970s, including reports that had never been officially filed with Department 13. One report, dated 1968, described a top-secret meeting between Soviet and American military officials. The meeting had occurred in neutral Geneva, off the books, not part of any formal diplomatic process. The subject, unidentified aerial phenomena that both superpowers were encountering but neither would publicly acknowledge. According to the document, both sides admitted to regular incursions by objects demonstrating impossible capabilities. Both had lost aircraft and pilots under mysterious circumstances. Both had accumulated extensive documentation they couldn't explain. The meeting concluded with an informal agreement. Neither side would publicly reveal what they knew, to avoid public panic and maintain the appearance of military competency. The revelation was explosive. It confirmed that the phenomenon wasn't Soviet or American. Both superpowers were equally baffled and equally helpless. The Cold War, with its nuclear standoff and existential threats, had been playing out against a backdrop of something far stranger. Something both sides knew about but refused to acknowledge. In 2008, Strogoff published his final work on the subject, The Vanished Complete Documentation of Soviet Aircraft Disappearances, 1946-1991. The book was 600 pages of meticulously documented cases, supporting evidence, witness testimony, and technical analysis. It included the full story of Bajenov and Mironov, along with 17 other similar incidents spanning Soviet history. The book's conclusion was carefully worded but unmistakable. The evidence suggests that unidentified objects of unknown origin operated regularly in Soviet airspace for over 4 decades. These objects demonstrated capabilities that remain unexplained by conventional physics or aeronautical engineering. On multiple documented occasions, they engaged with Soviet military aircraft in ways that resulted in disappearance of pilots and planes. Despite extensive investigation by Soviet authorities, no definitive explanation was ever determined. The phenomenon remains unexplained. By 2010, most of the original witnesses had died. Major Dolgov passed away in 1998. Captain Konetsov died in 2004, taking with him the clearest eyewitness testimony of the Bayanov-Mironov incident. Senior Lieutenant Volkov, the radar operator who had first detected the object, died in 2007. Each left behind recorded testimony, preserved for future researchers, but the living connection to that March night in 1953 was fading. Katerina Bajenova died in 2012 at age 86. Until the end, she maintained that her husband hadn't died in a training accident, that something had taken him, and that somewhere, somehow, he might still exist. Her children inherited her files, letters, documents, the medals awarded posthumously, and the dream journal she'd kept intermittently over the decades, recording moments when she felt her husband's presence. In 2015, the Russian government declassified additional Department 13 files. Among them was the gun camera footage from the 1953 incident, 30 seconds of grainy black-and-white film showing a metallic disc hovering against the night sky, then moving with impossible speed. The footage was analyzed by modern aerospace engineers. Their conclusion: the object's performance characteristics couldn't be explained by any known propulsion system, past or present. The truth had emerged, incomplete, fragmentary, but undeniable. On March 14, 1953, 2 Soviet pilots had pursued something beyond human understanding into the darkness above Soviet skies. They had been taken, vanished, removed from existence by something that demonstrated capabilities that remained, 70 years later, completely unexplained. The Soviet government had hidden this truth for 4 decades, but the truth had survived. In classified files, in witness testimony, in radar data and radio recordings, in the memories of those who had seen and could never forget, and in the questions that remained unanswered, that might never be answered, about what happened to Captain Yuri Bajenov and Lieutenant Alexei Mironov in those final moments before they disappeared forever. The evidence was now public. The cover-up had been exposed, but the mystery remained as deep as ever, because revealing what happened wasn't the same as explaining it. And explanation, after 70 years of investigation, remained as elusive as the objects themselves. 70 years have passed since that March morning, when Captain Yuri Bajenov and Lieutenant Alexei Mironov climbed into their MiG-15s and disappeared into history. The Soviet Union that sent them skyward no longer exists. The Cold War that framed their mission is long over. The technology they flew is museum pieces, but the questions remain unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. What really happened at 3:07 a.m. on March 14, 1953? The evidence tells us the facts. 2 experienced pilots pursued an object demonstrating capabilities that defied known physics. They reported losing control. Radar tracked them accelerating beyond their aircraft's limits, climbing to impossible altitudes, then vanishing simultaneously with the object they were chasing. No wreckage was ever found. No bodies were recovered. No explanation was ever confirmed. But facts don't equal understanding. 7 decades of investigation, thousands of pages of documentation, hundreds of witness testimonies, and we're no closer to comprehending what took those men. Were they killed instantly? Are they still alive somewhere beyond our reach? Did they experience something so far beyond human reference that we lack the vocabulary to describe it? The families never got closure. Katerina Bajenova spent 59 years as a widow, haunted by dreams suggesting her husband was still conscious somewhere, trapped and unable to return. That possibility, however remote, is perhaps more terrible than simple death. At least death provides finality. The disappeared exist in permanent limbo, neither confirmed dead nor possibly alive. Modern analysis of the declassified data confirms what Soviet investigators secretly concluded in the 1950s. The object's performance exceeded anything achievable by human technology, then or now. Instantaneous acceleration, right-angle turns at hypersonic speeds, vertical climbs generating hundreds of G-forces, the ability to affect aircraft control systems, and possibly pilot consciousness itself. The 1968 secret meeting between US and Soviet officials revealed this wasn't isolated to Soviet airspace. Both superpowers encountered the same phenomena. Both lost aircraft and pilots under similar circumstances. Both maintained public silence, while privately accumulating evidence they couldn't explain. The conspiracy wasn't between governments. It was both governments conspiring to hide their shared ignorance from their populations. That conspiracy of silence shaped how we understand these events. By hiding the truth, both sides prevented serious scientific investigation. Evidence was locked away instead of analyzed. Witnesses were silenced instead of studied. We are only now, in the 21st century, beginning to examine data that should have been investigated in the 1950s, when memories were fresh and witnesses were alive. The pattern continues. Modern military pilots still encounter objects demonstrating impossible capabilities. The U.S. Navy's 2004 Nimitz incident, the 2015 East Coast encounters, numerous other documented cases show the same characteristics. Objects that shouldn't exist performing maneuvers that shouldn't be possible. The technology gap between these objects and our most advanced aircraft remains as vast as it was in 1953. Perhaps most disturbing is the abduction pattern. Bajanov and Miranov weren't unique. At least 18 other Soviet aircraft disappeared under similar circumstances. American, British, and other NATO forces reported comparable losses. Pilots pursuing unknown objects, reporting loss of control, then vanishing. The phenomenon showed selectivity, purpose, intent. What happened to those pilots? Department 13 analysts theorized they might still exist somewhere, somehow trying to communicate with families through dreams and inexplicable sensations. The theory sounds like desperate hope, but the documented family experiences across multiple cases suggest something beyond coincidence. Multiple widows reporting identical dreams, children sensing father's presence decades after disappearance, phenomena that shouldn't happen but did, repeatedly, consistently. The Bajanov-Miranov incident stands as perhaps the best documented case of aerial abduction in history. The radar data survived. The radio recordings were preserved. Multiple witnesses testified. The gun camera footage was archived. Everything needed to prove something extraordinary happened is available. What we lack is explanation, and explanation may be forever beyond reach. At the Russian Air Force Museum in Moscow, a memorial wall lists pilots who died in service. Among thousands of names are Bajanov and Miranov, marked lost March 14, 1953. The notation doesn't say killed, doesn't say crashed, just lost, because after 70 years that's all we can say with certainty. They were lost. Taken by something we still don't understand, and somewhere in the vast darkness above Earth, in realms we can't access and barely imagine, they might still be lost, still aware, still trying to come home. The truth emerged from Soviet archives. But truth without understanding is just documented mystery. We know what happened. We have no idea why. And after 7 decades, that ignorance weighs heavier than any classified file ever did. 2 pilots chased the impossible and became it. The sky took them. And the sky has never given them back.